Hello, this is Mark Holmes, the Senior Editorial Director of Via Satellite, and I'm delighted to be back with one of our Thursday morning conversations. With me today is Martijn Blanken, the CEO of NEO Space Group, exciting new company in our sector. Firstly, Martin, obviously the company is based in Saudi Arabia. How are you finding life in Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, actually, I'm enjoying it more than I had expected, in all honesty. It's obviously, we're coming to the end of the summer. And as you can imagine, it can get quite hot over here. But it's mostly the Saudis themselves who are complaining about the heat. It's Riyadh and it's quite dry, the heat. So it's actually bearable. It's from that perspective, a good place to live. And culturally, it's super exciting to be in a different culture, different country, different culture, different people, different habits. I find it quite exhilarating.
Fantastic. I mean, obviously, we're here to talk about the NEO Space Group, and so can you sort of tell us, maybe for some of our audience who are maybe not familiar with the company and what you're looking to do, tell us a little bit about NEO Space Group.
Well, NEO Space Group is a startup in a way. It's been founded by and backed by the PIF, the Public Investment Fund, which is one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the world, and it's Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund. And as part of Vision 2030, which is a national program here in Saudi Arabia that aims to diversify the economy and move away from the dependency on fossil fuels. And then they've identified 13 different sectors in which they are going to invest to build new economies. And space is one of them. And to that end, they decided to establish the NEO Space Group. And they position it as the national champion in satellite and space, but also a future global leader. And its remit is quite broad. It spans across satellite communications, as well as geospatial, as well as PNT. And on the side, we're also setting up a venture capital fund that will invest in new space technology companies. So a very broad remit, anchored here in Saudi Arabia, but it's very much going to be an international business.
I want to come to those business lines a little bit later, but I want to go back to the 2030 vision, because I mean, even outside of the satellite press, we've heard a lot about this 2030 vision. But I'm sort of intrigued about how space and the NEO Space Group, how it's all going to fit into that overall vision.
Look, as I mentioned, the aim is to make the country a lot less dependent on its fossil fuels. But at the same time, there's also a remarkable cultural, evolution. Some people would even call a revolution happening here in Saudi Arabia, where things are progressing at a very rapid pace. Where things that in the outside world, before I came to Australia, I thought that there were quite a few restrictions on day-to-day life. Imposed by sort of cultural habits, often driven by religious customs. A lot of them have changed quite dramatically. Imagine if you would have been a woman living here in Saudi Arabia 7-8 years ago, you would have to be chaperoned. You could not drive to work. You would not be able to travel on your own internationally. And now women live in their own apartments, get into their own cars, drive to work where they sit amongst men and females. They're mingled. They can go whenever they want, and they live a completely different life. And this is just one example of also the cultural evolution taking place here in the country. And as you may have seen, they invest quite heavily in a couple of giga projects. NEOM is often used, the Red Sea project. A lot of time, effort, energy, and money goes into setting up the tourism sector here in Saudi Arabia, all with the aim to open up Saudi Arabia to the rest of the world and again move away from the dependency on fossil fuels.
Okay. I mean, you mentioned PIF, and that's a world-renowned sovereign growth fund. We hear that name a lot beyond the satellite sector as well. What are the particular benefits for sort of the NEO Space Group here?
Well, the benefit of any sovereign wealth fund, for that matter, is that it is supposed to invest its money, but also look after the interest of the country it belongs to. So it has a very long-term horizon. That means that the plans that we're developing and partially the process of executing have a 10, 15, 20-year horizon in mind, which is very different compared to privately held companies or publicly listed companies, depending on the stage at which such a company is. But there's often much more a shorter-term focus. There need to be immediate short-term results in order to satisfy the various stakeholders. Sometimes there could be shareholders who expect a dividend. Sometimes it could be a private equity owner who has a closed fund and need to exit within a certain period of time. Those dynamics are not at play within a sovereign wealth fund. That is not to say that driving returns on the investments is not important. Obviously it is. But you can do that much more with a longer term horizon in mind. The cost of capital tend to be a bit lower as well. Therefore, the required returns relative to some of the privately held companies are also a bit lower. And it allows you to do a little bit more that potentially would not be possible in a private setting.
Okay. I mean, you spoke about the company, as a startup, having a startup, maybe having a startup mentality. I mean, ultimately, what is the business model for the Neo Space Group, and how are you going to make money and actually build a profitable business, even with this backing?
Yeah, there are going to be, in the main, two different business models. One is more the downstream business model where we become a service provider to end customers. Could be governments or government organizations, could be enterprises. And you leverage the assets of various players in the industry. So we would buy satellite capacity from whoever is willing to sell it to its channel partners. And we put that together and make that into a compelling solution for end customers. Could be in-flight communications for airlines, or could be communication solutions on oil rigs, for example. Or it could be insights that we provide based on geospatial information gathered by satellites that will help the cadastral services to make sure that people are not building or constructing illegally outside of the land that they happen to own, whatever the application may be. But it's a downstream activity where you are a value-added reseller of other people's capability. The second business model is where you own and operate infrastructure. Could be satellite infrastructure, could be ground infrastructure. We aspire to do both. They're completely separate business models. They clearly interlink, but we will treat them fairly separately.
I'm intrigued by that in terms of investing in satellite infrastructure. I mean, obviously that's something that, as you know, we cover a lot in Viasat. What does that look like for the Neo Space Group?
Yeah, as I mentioned, we're currently looking at a more broader constellation strategy. The important thing is that we want to start with the market and with the demand in the market. You're not going to build and launch satellites into orbit if you're not convinced that there is a subsegment in the market that you are able to serve. And it may sound very obvious, but I can tell you in my first couple of months here in this role, we've been approached by quite a few people who seem to take a different approach. It's sort of a build and they shall come. Well, that's certainly not something that we want to support. Part of that demand, not surprisingly, will come from, let's call it sovereign demand, from government institutions, defense and intelligence organizations within the kingdom or potentially within the region that require a level of sovereignty. They don't necessarily want to be served by anyone. That is a demand that we're trying to serve. But beyond that, there's lots of other sort of verticals that we aspire to serve, not only here in the kingdom, but outside of the kingdom as well. So that means that we are considering investing in potentially in satellite communications, satellite both broadband and narrowband, geospatial, and potentially in positioning and navigation and timing satellites as well. Which comes first is yet to be seen. We're sort of halfway through this exercise. I think towards the end of the year, the beginning of the new year, we have more clarity if so where we're going to be allocating the capital to in the infrastructure side.
Just before I get onto those business segments, when do you think realistically the earliest is that you might be in a position to put satellites up?
Well, firstly, there is one satellite that we have started to operationalize and commercialize. It's a satellite called SGS-1, the Saudi Geo Satellite 1. That is an asset that is in the process of being operationally and commercially transferred to the Neospace Group. And we have signed the first customers with services that will use that particular satellite. When we will be ready to make the first decisions, I expect that will be Q1, maybe slipping into Q2 of 2025.
Okay. I mean, you mentioned some different segments. I think 4 in total in terms of where the company is targeting. Which of those 4 do you think might be the most lucrative, or is there 1 or 2 that you think will have sort of a sharper initial growth? I mean, I'm just sort of, compare and contrast the different, these different areas.
Yeah, your question was which one is the most lucrative. So we're looking at more at which are the areas where A, there is tangible customer demand, and B, where we can get an acceptable return on investment. And obviously, capital is not infinite. And if we can stack rank, and there are projects that have a higher return than others, and obviously the ones with the highest return will go first. But capital returns are not the single, it's not the only criteria that we will use. As I mentioned, the role of the Neospace Group is also to be a catalyst to build a space economy here in the region and in Saudi Arabia in particular. And therefore, aspects like job creation and attracting space-related industries to the kingdom are important factors to take into consideration as well. So I just want to nuance the notion a little bit that the lucrative is obviously not unimportant, but it's not the only criteria that we will have in mind. In the most advanced, we're in the geospatial domain, where we already have there was a value-added service provider that took images from the Maxars and the planets and the Airbuses of the world and translate that into insights, mainly here in the Saudi Arabian market. We will build on that. And in parallel, next to that, the regulator here in the kingdom has issued a tender a couple of months ago, to which we responded to build an Earth observation wholesale platform, which basically means that there will be one platform here in the kingdom. NSG won that tender. We will be building a platform that will collect imageries from whether it's optical or synthetic aperture radar or hyperspectral or maybe aerial images or in situ data, and that all feeds into the platform, and value-added service providers can use that to provide insights to their customers, both here in the kingdom and outside of the kingdom. So these are sort of 2 concrete areas in the geospatial domain. These are not in the infrastructure play, but these are in the services play where we already have started investing. When it comes down to the infrastructure place, it could be that we're focusing on specific geospatial infrastructure solutions, but I suspect we will also be doing something in the SATCOM space. And we're currently considering both narrowband and broadband, and both at a geospatial, but also in the non-geoso segment. We're looking into if Saudi Arabia should play a role in that market, and if so, how. It's not likely that we will be it's not likely we will become a competitor of Starlink for that matter. They have done an outstanding job building an ecosystem that wasn't there, and others will be following suit. So we will be very likely happy customers of those constellations. But there may be particular sovereign demand that can only be met with certain investments that the Neospace Group, as the national champion here in Saudi Arabia, will be able to provide.
I mean, if we can talk about like sustainable growth, I mean, I think that's obviously going to be I mean, you've hinted upon that in some of your answers already, but I mean, it's one thing to talk about it; it's another thing to achieve it. How do you think you will achieve it?
Look, it starts with customers, right? So if we're a new player in a market that it's fair to say, some people would argue even that it's overcrowded. So there's only so much demand in the market. And if we can't justify our existence in the eyes of prospective customers, then there is not going to be sustainable growth, Mark. I think that's the obvious one. I'm spent most of my career in telecoms, and in telecoms, certainly in international telecoms, it's quite common that you work with parties that on day one are your competitor, on day two your customer, and on day three your supplier. I think something similar is starting to happen here within the in the satellite industry as well. So it's the second sort of leg to the sustainability stool is that you become a meaningful and positive contributor to the wider global ecosystem, and that goes through respectful partnerships where from time to time you can end up in a situation where you compete, but the next day you could be very well be working together on achieving an outcome that serves both parties, or multiple parties for the matter. Let's face it, the world is a very big space, and space in itself serves the entire planet, unlike terrestrial telecoms networks. So almost by definition, you have to find partnerships in various parts of the world to also de-risk, because if you launch a satellite, you're going to be covering a lot of space that you don't necessarily have a right to serve. So you do that mostly through the partnerships. So convincing customers, having compelling partners, and then also maintaining a proper cost base so you can remain competitive from a financial and economic perspective. I think those are the three key pillars to building a sustainable growth business.
Do you think the company, I mean, we hear the term disruptor a lot, and obviously, mentioning Starlink and what they've done and the impact they've had on the industry. But bearing in mind what Neospace Group is looking to do, the backing that it has, and the ambition that it has, do you believe that the company will be a disruptor in this sector as well?
I think in a certain way we will be, absolutely. Look, there are a few distinct benefits of entering the market at this stage, backed by a visionary investor who has the ability to allocate meaningful amounts of capital to it. We're not burdened by any legacy revenues. Most existing satellite operators have a challenge that their traditional revenue stream from broadcast is in decline. And I haven't met too many people who would argue that that is going to stop anytime soon. And similarly, many of them are burdened by quite a bit of debt. We don't have debt, we don't have legacy issues. And I've worked in an adjacent industry in telecoms for many years, and I know how much time and energy it can consume from senior management if you have to address legacy issues. We don't have all of that. So all of the legacy issues, that is for other people to resolve. So we have all of our mind space can be allocated to doing something different that is more compelling in the eyes of our customers, and not hindered by any legacy or any history. And that means that we're not a LEO or a MEO or a GEO player. We're going to be a multi-orbit player. We don't necessarily have to own all the assets. We're happily a reseller as well as an owner for some selected assets, if that makes sense. We're not bound by certain technologies, by certain spectral blocks. We can choose and pick and choose wherever we think we can find a space in the market where we can make a difference relative to the other players, leveraging the strengths of other players and building our own capabilities on top of that. I think that is quite a unique position to be in.
I mean, it seems clear that when it comes to getting business in sort of Saudi Arabia, I imagine you'll get a fair bit of business there. Will sort of like the acid test for the company be what it's able to do outside of Saudi Arabia and the business it's able to generate internationally?
Yeah, of course. Look, if one would invest in satellite infrastructure, being a single satellite or a smaller constellation or ground stations for that matter, by definition, almost you will not get a good return on that investment if you just focus on one particular country or one particular geography, simply because the coverage is so much broader. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It is an and, not an either or. We will, but it's also in that order. If we cannot justify our existence here in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, if we cannot convince the various major users of satellite capacity that we are going to be a credible player, I think it's going to be pretty difficult to convince international governments or private organizations, enterprises for that matter, that we are a credible player. But you need to do both in order to get to that healthy return on investment. So yeah, that's the task that lays ahead of us.
Okay, and just sort of a final couple of questions. new company, new CEO, new era, new vision, and but in sort of 12 months time, if we're talking in 12 months time at the end of 2025, where do you expect Neo Space Group to be? What's sort of the 12-month outlook?
I think that we will have build partially organically, partially through partnerships, and partially through acquisitions, a reasonably meaningful business. It will generate somewhere between $200 and $300 million of revenue, perhaps a little bit more, depending if certain acquisitions will go ahead. It will employ people in somewhere between 15 and 20 countries, and it will have built a meaningful business both in the satellite comms space as well as in the geospatial space here in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and outside of it. And it will employ a substantial number of people here in the Kingdom. And in doing so, we can point to some of the key objectives that we've been tasked with, that we're on our trajectory, that by 2030 we are becoming that national champion in the global play.
You mentioned acquisitions there, and it would be remiss for me not to at least ask the question: how close maybe are you to announcing anything there?
I expect that we will be announcing one or potentially multiple acquisitions before the end of this year.
Okay. Well, I think I'll leave it there. Martijn, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you today. It's always great when we see new companies emerge, particularly ones with very bold visions and strong ambitions. I mean, it's always great to see it in this sector. So I wish you and your team all the best for the rest of the year and the challenges ahead, and look forward to seeing how the Neo Space Group gets on. So yeah, on behalf of Via Satellite, we wish you all the best and thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Mark. It's been a pleasure.